The wind howled like a ghost through the towering pines, its icy breath cutting across the snow-covered wilderness. Thick clouds smothered the moon, leaving the night in near-total darkness. The only sound was the crunch of boots pressing into frozen ground. Daniel adjusted the strap of his backpack, pulling his coat tighter against the brutal cold. He had been hiking for hours, far off the usual trails. The nearest town was miles away, and there were no roads, no signs of civilization, just the vast, untamed wilderness stretching endlessly around him. Then he heard it. A low, broken whimper. His body tensed. The sound was faint, almost lost in the wind, but unmistakable. He stopped, holding his breath. Silence followed. Maybe he imagined it. Then it came again. Weak. Desperate. Not human. Daniel's heartbeat quickened as he swung his flashlight in the direction of the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the thick snow ahead. Nothing. He took a step forward, then another. The cold bit at his face, but his focus sharpened. He wasn't alone. His boot slipped slightly on a patch of ice, and he steadied himself, listening. The whimper came again, this time followed by a sharp exhale, almost a sigh. He swept the flashlight in a slow arc, then stopped. A shape lay motionless in the snow, barely visible against the frozen ground. His pulse pounded as he moved closer, his breath clouding in the freezing air. The shape took form under the light, a wolf. She was lying on her side, her ribs pushing against her fur. Blood stained the snow beneath her, dark and fresh. Her breathing was slow, uneven. Daniel hesitated. A wild animal. Injured. And wolves weren't small, they were powerful predators, even when weak. But something was wrong. She didn't move. Her amber eyes flickered open, barely registering his presence. He had seen wild animals before, deer, bears, even wolves from a distance, but never like this. The fight was gone from her eyes. There was no snarl, no attempt to run. Then he noticed her belly, swollen, rounded. Pregnant. His chest tightened. This wasn't just an injured wolf. She was carrying life inside her, life that would never get the chance to be born if she didn't make it through the night. Daniel exhaled, forcing himself to think. A wild animal in this condition wouldn't last much longer in the cold. A part of him told him to walk away. This was nature. Survival of the fittest. But another part, something deeper, refused to let him leave her like this. He crouched slowly, his fingers tightening around the handle of his knife, just in case. One wrong move, and she could lash out. But she didn't. She was too weak. Carefully, he removed his gloves and reached toward her. The wolf flinched, her breath quickening, but she didn't have the strength to move away. His fingers brushed against her fur, cold, damp from the melting snow. She was fading. Daniel glanced around. There was no sign of a pack. Wolves rarely traveled alone, especially not one in this condition. If she was out here by herself, something must have happened. Maybe she had been separated. Maybe her pack had abandoned her. He looked back down at her. Leaving her here meant death. But taking her with him? That was a risk of its own. The wind picked up, slicing through his coat, as if the world itself was reminding him that time was running out. He made his decision. Moving quickly but carefully, he removed his coat and wrapped it around the wolf. She barely reacted. Lifting her wasn't easy, she was heavier than she looked, but he managed to hoist her into his arms. Her body was limp against him, her breathing shallow. The trek back to his cabin was brutal. The weight of the wolf slowed him down, and the cold bit harder with every step. His muscles burned, but he pushed forward. He had to. By the time he reached the small wooden cabin, his body was numb, his breath ragged. He kicked the door open, stepping inside and shutting it quickly behind him. Warmth rushed over him from the fireplace, a welcome contrast to the freezing air outside. Carefully, he lowered the wolf onto an old blanket near the fire. She let out a soft whine, shifting slightly. Her fur was still damp, but at least she was out of the cold. Daniel knelt beside her, assessing the damage. The blood on her side wasn't fresh, it had started to clot, which meant the wound wasn't actively bleeding anymore. But she was weak. Too weak to give birth if the time came. He rummaged through his supplies, pulling out a bowl and filling it with warm water. Slowly, he set it near her mouth. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then, finally, she lifted her head slightly, lapping at the water with slow, hesitant movements. It wasn't much, but it was something. As the hours passed, Daniel kept watch, feeding her small pieces of dried meat, watching for any signs of worsening. He had no idea what he was doing, but he knew one thing: he wasn't going to let her die. When dawn broke, the wolf was still alive. Her breathing had steadied, and her eyes held a bit more awareness. She wasn't out of danger yet, but there was a spark of life in her now, a fight she hadn't had the night before. Daniel exhaled, rubbing his tired eyes. He didn't know what the coming days would bring. But as he looked at the wolf, wrapped in his old coat, he knew one thing: her story wasn't over yet. The morning light filtered through the wooden blinds, casting soft shadows across the cabin floor. The warmth from the fireplace had filled the small space, chasing away the night's bitter cold. Daniel sat in his old wooden chair, his eyes fixed on the wolf lying near the fire. She was still breathing. That was a good sign. Her eyes opened slowly, scanning the unfamiliar space. When they met his, he stayed still, not wanting to startle her. He expected fear, maybe aggression. Instead, she only blinked, exhausted. Daniel leaned forward, reaching for the bowl of water. "You still with me?" His voice was quiet, unsure if she understood the sound or just the calmness in it. He slid the bowl closer. She sniffed the air, then weakly moved her head forward to lap at the water. Relief washed over him. She was drinking. That meant she was fighting to stay alive. But she needed more than water. Daniel stood and walked to the small wooden counter, rummaging through his supplies. He had dried meat, some leftover venison from his last hunting trip. He pulled out a small piece, broke it into smaller chunks, and knelt beside her again. She watched him. Not with fear, but with something else: caution, maybe curiosity. Slowly, he placed a piece of meat near her nose. She sniffed, but didn't eat. He frowned. Maybe she was too weak. He placed another piece a little closer to her mouth. This time, she licked it but didn't take it. "Come on," he muttered, as if she could understand. A few long minutes passed before she finally opened her mouth and took the food. It was small, but it was a start. For the next few hours, he kept a careful eye on her, feeding her in small portions, making sure she stayed warm. Her breathing grew steadier, and though she barely moved, she was no longer just waiting for the end. As the afternoon rolled in, Daniel sat back, stretching his tired limbs. He had barely slept, watching over her like some kind of guardian. "You don't look like much of a threat now," he said, glancing at her still form. The wolf let out a soft exhale, something between a sigh and a quiet growl. Daniel chuckled. "That makes two of us." The scar on her side. By evening, she attempted to shift her position. A sharp whimper broke the silence, and Daniel immediately knelt beside her. He noticed the wound on her side again, partially hidden under thick fur. Gently, he pushed the fur aside. The gash was deep, but not fresh. It was healing, though it had clotted unevenly. His brows furrowed. It didn't look like a bite from another animal. Claw marks would have been more jagged, less precise. This was something else. A cut. He inhaled sharply. A blade? A trap? Had a human done this to her? His jaw tightened at the thought. If someone had tried to kill her, they had failed. And she had made it here, alone. The mystery of her survival weighed on him. Why had her pack abandoned her? Wolves protected their own, especially a pregnant female. Something had forced her away. Or maybe, someone. Daniel shook the thought from his head. Right now, that didn't matter. She needed time. As the night stretched on, he sat near the fire, watching over her. Her breathing had deepened, sleep. A small victory. Days of recovery. The next morning, she was still alive. And the morning after that. Daniel found himself settling into a routine, feeding her, keeping the fire going, watching for any signs of distress. The first time she lifted her head on her own, he felt something he hadn't expected. Pride. She was fighting. And somehow, in a way he didn't quite understand, he felt responsible for her. By the fourth day, she tried to stand. Her legs wobbled, and she collapsed almost immediately, letting out a frustrated huff. Daniel watched, resisting the urge to help. She had to do this herself. The next time, she managed to stay upright for a few seconds before sinking back down. Progress. Each day, she grew stronger. Her body filled out as she ate more. Her eyes, once dull and lifeless, now had a sharpness to them. And then, one morning, she took her first steps. Daniel had just finished refilling the firewood when he heard the soft sound behind him. He turned, eyes widening. She was standing. Wobbly, unsure, but standing. And then, slowly, she took a step forward. Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding. She was no longer helpless. She was healing. But the biggest question remained. What had happened to her pack? And when the time came, would they come back for her? The wind howled through the trees, carrying a chill that seeped into Daniel's bones. The wolf lay near the fireplace, her breathing steady, her wounds healing. She had grown stronger over the past week, her muscles filling out, her eyes sharper. But something had changed. She had become restless. Daniel noticed it in the way she held herself, ears pricked, eyes scanning the cabin door, body tense. She wasn't just recovering anymore. She was waiting for something. Or someone. A call from the wild. That night, Daniel sat by the fire, sipping his coffee, when he heard it. A long, mournful howl echoed through the valley. The wolf's ears shot up. Her head lifted. A flicker of recognition flashed in her golden eyes. Daniel set his mug down, watching her. She didn't move, but he saw the change in her posture, the way her body stiffened, her breathing quickened. Another howl followed. Closer this time. Daniel's stomach twisted. The pack. He knew wolves didn't just call out for no reason. This was a message, a signal. They were looking for someone. Were they looking for her? She let out a small whimper, her gaze flicking between the door and Daniel. He leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. Is that them? She didn't answer, but she didn't need to. Her body was already giving him the answer. Another howl. This time, it was different, shorter, sharper. A warning. Daniel stood, grabbing his rifle from the wall. He didn't want trouble, but wolves were unpredictable. If they thought their pack mate was in danger, they might attack. He moved to the window, peering out into the night. The snow-covered ground stretched out before him, the tree line barely visible under the dim moonlight. Silence. Then, movement. Shadows shifted between the trees. Dark figures, gliding across the snow with eerie silence. They were here. The standoff. Daniel took a slow breath, gripping the rifle tighter. His heart pounded, but he stayed calm. The wolf inside the cabin let out a soft whine, her ears flattened against her head. She was nervous, but not afraid. Daniel glanced at her. "They're waiting for you, aren't they?" She didn't move. Outside, the largest of the shadows stepped forward. A massive wolf, easily the size of a small bear, emerged from the tree line. His fur was thick and silver, his eyes piercing in the darkness. He stood still, head high, tail slightly raised, a leader. Daniel's breath caught. This was no ordinary wolf. This was an alpha. The pack didn't move. They watched. Waiting. Then, the alpha let out a low, deep growl. A demand. Daniel's gut twisted. He knew what this meant. The pack wanted her back. But she wasn't ready. Or was she? The wolf inside the cabin slowly stood on shaky legs. Her body swayed, but she didn't collapse. She took a step forward. Then another. Daniel's chest tightened. Was she going to leave? He knelt beside her. "You sure about this?" She met his gaze, and for the first time, he saw something unspoken in her eyes. Gratitude. Loyalty. But also, a choice. She wasn't running to them. She was deciding. A test of trust. The alpha outside took another step forward. His deep, golden eyes locked onto Daniel's through the window. A silent challenge. Daniel felt the weight of the moment. Wolves were wild creatures, but they understood loyalty, bonds, and respect. The alpha was testing him. Would he give her up? Or had she become part of something else, something beyond the pack? Daniel inhaled deeply, then did something he wasn't sure was wise. He stepped away from the door. Giving her the choice. She hesitated. Her gaze flickered between him and the outside world. Then, she took a step toward the door. Daniel's chest tightened. He didn't know why it hurt, but it did. Another step. Then, she stopped. Her head turned back, eyes locking onto his. She didn't want to go. Not yet. Outside, the alpha let out a soft growl. He wasn't angry, just waiting. Then, as if understanding her decision, he stepped back into the shadows. The rest of the pack followed, disappearing into the night. They had accepted her choice. For now. Daniel exhaled, realizing he had been holding his breath. The wolf turned back, slowly walking toward him. She settled back near the fire, curling into a ball. She had made her decision. And for the first time, Daniel realized something strange. He wasn't just protecting her. She was protecting him, too. The days passed in uneasy silence. The pack had left, but their presence still lingered. Daniel could feel it every time he stepped outside, an unseen tension in the air, as if the forest itself was waiting for something. The wolf, who he had simply started calling Shadow, had grown stronger. Her limp had faded, and her fur had regained its healthy sheen. She moved with more confidence now, pacing the cabin at night, ears always tuned to the world outside. She was waiting. Daniel knew the pack would return. It wasn't a question of if, but when. Tracks in the snow. One morning, while chopping wood outside, Daniel noticed something. Tracks. Fresh ones. They circled the cabin, careful, deliberate. The prints were large, bigger than any lone wolf's. The pack had been here. Watching. Shadow stood at the door, her golden eyes scanning the treeline. She knew they were close. Daniel wiped sweat from his brow, his grip tightening around the axe. He wasn't afraid, at least, not for himself. But he had no idea what would happen when they finally showed themselves again. Would they come for her? Would they accept her choice to stay? Or would they see him as a threat? That night, the answer came. The silent visitors. Daniel woke to the sound of soft movement outside. Not footsteps, not breaking branches, just the subtle shift of weight on fresh snow. Shadow was already awake, standing near the door. Her ears twitched. Her body tensed. Daniel moved carefully, reaching for his rifle. Not to use it, just to have it. Then, a soft sound. Not a howl. Not a growl. A whimper. Daniel frowned. He hadn't expected that. He moved toward the window, peering out. The moonlight reflected off the snow, revealing dark figures standing at the edge of the clearing. Not just wolves. Pups. 3 small, unsteady pups huddled near the base of a tree. Their fur was thick, but they looked cold, their tiny bodies pressing against each other for warmth. And standing beside them, watching, was the alpha. Daniel's breath caught. This was no attack. This was something else entirely. A test. Shadow let out a soft whimper. She stepped forward, pressing her nose against the door. She wanted to go to them. But she hesitated. Daniel could see it in her stance, the pull between 2 worlds. She had survived with him. She had healed in his care. But this was her family. Daniel exhaled slowly. Go, he said, voice barely above a whisper. She turned to him, eyes searching his face. He nodded. Go. For a moment, she didn't move. Then, she stepped forward. The door creaked as it opened, and the cold rushed in. Shadow padded outside, her paws barely making a sound on the snow. The pack remained still. The alpha stood firm, watching. The pups stumbled forward, yipping excitedly. One of them nuzzled against Shadow's leg, whining. A reunion. But it wasn't just that. It was a choice. Shadow turned her head, looking back at Daniel. Something passed between them in that moment. Something unspoken. She was part of the wild. Part of the pack. But she was also something else now. Something more. The alpha let out a deep huff, then turned, leading the pack back into the woods. Shadow followed, but just before disappearing into the trees, she paused. She looked back one last time. Then, she was gone. Daniel stood in the doorway, the cold biting at his skin. He had saved her life. But in the end, she had saved something in him, too. A reminder. That some bonds, no matter how unlikely, never truly break. The cabin felt different without her. The silence stretched longer, the fire burned lower, and the nights felt colder. Daniel tried to shake it off. She was a wolf. She belonged with her pack. That was the natural way of things. But why did it feel so wrong? Footsteps in the snow. Days turned into weeks. Winter tightened its grip on the valley, and the snow piled high against the cabin walls. One morning, while checking the trapline, Daniel noticed something strange. Footsteps. Not wolf tracks, human ones. They were deep, fresh, leading toward the tree line but disappearing where the snow had been disturbed. Someone had been here. Watching. Daniel's jaw tightened. The mountains were no place for aimless wanderers. Either this was a hunter, a lost traveler, or something worse. He followed the tracks a few yards before stopping. A chill ran down his spine. The tracks weren't alone. Wolf prints circled them, large ones. And at least one set belonged to Shadow. He recognized the familiar pattern of her step. What was she doing near a stranger? Daniel's stomach twisted. Something wasn't right. The stranger in the woods. That night, the storm rolled in. Wind slammed against the cabin, howling through the trees like a wounded animal. The fire flickered, casting long shadows against the log walls. Then, a sound. Not the wind. Not the trees. A knock. Daniel's breath caught. He hadn't heard a knock on that door in years. Rifle in hand, he moved cautiously. Another knock. Weak. Faint. Almost desperate. He opened the door. A man stood there, barely upright. His face was pale, lips cracked from the cold, eyes wild with exhaustion. Snow clung to his beard and heavy coat. And behind him, barely visible in the storm, Shadow. Her golden eyes glowed in the darkness, her breath rising in the frigid air. She had brought him here. A desperate plea. Daniel grabbed the man before he collapsed, dragging him inside. He shut the door against the storm, then turned to face the unexpected visitor. The man shivered violently, his hands raw from exposure. Daniel moved quickly, wrapping him in a blanket and pushing a mug of hot coffee into his trembling hands. For a moment, the man just breathed, eyes darting around the cabin before settling on Daniel. Then, he spoke. I wouldn't have made it without her. His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. Daniel glanced at Shadow, who had settled near the fire, shaking the snow from her thick coat. The man took a shaky sip of coffee. She found me, led me here. Daniel frowned. Who are you? The man swallowed hard. His gaze dropped. A dead man, if not for her. A dangerous secret. Daniel studied him carefully. The man's clothes were expensive, too nice for a simple hunter. His boots were sturdy, but they weren't meant for long treks in deep snow. Something about him didn't fit. You're not. The fire crackled softly, but the tension in the cabin drowned out its warmth. Daniel watched the stranger, his fingers tapping against his mug. Shadow lay near the door, her golden eyes unblinking. She knew something. You said people don't want you alive, Daniel finally said. Who exactly are you running from? The man exhaled, staring into the fire. Name's Carter. His voice was low, almost hesitant. Used to work for the wrong kind of people. When I tried to walk away, they didn't take it well. Daniel frowned. What kind of people? Carter shook his head. The kind that don't let loose ends walk free. He rubbed his hands together, as if trying to shake off the cold that wasn't just from the storm. They came after me. I ran. Thought I lost them in the mountains. But I was wrong. Daniel's jaw tightened. He had lived in these woods long enough to know when danger was coming. If Carter was being hunted, that meant trouble wasn't far behind. How long ago? Carter hesitated. Maybe a day. Maybe less. Daniel cursed under his breath. That meant they could already be close. Shadow let out a low whine. She stood, her ears twitching, sniffing the air. Then, she growled. Daniel followed her gaze to the window. The storm had calmed, but something was different. The silence outside felt unnatural. A presence. They weren't alone. The first gunshot shattered the quiet. The window exploded, shards of glass flying across the room. Daniel ducked instinctively, yanking Carter down with him. Shadow snarled, her hackles raised. She darted toward the door, ears pinned back. They found me, Carter gasped, clutching his side. Daniel didn't have time to argue. He grabbed his rifle, shoving extra rounds into his pocket. You bring trouble to my doorstep, you help me clean it up. Carter nodded, breathing heavily. He pulled a pistol from his coat, a sign he had come prepared for a fight. Daniel crouched near the broken window, peering out into the dark. The snow-covered trees cast long shadows, but movement gave them away. Figures in the distance, barely visible against the white. More than two. Maybe three. Maybe more. And they were closing in. A wolf's warning. Shadow let out a deep, guttural growl. Then, before Daniel could stop her, she bolted. "Shadow!" Daniel shouted, but she was already gone, disappearing into the storm, her dark coat blending with the night. A second gunshot rang out. This time, from deeper in the woods. A scream followed. Not a human scream. A wolf's. Daniel's heart pounded. Was it her? Was it her pack? No time to think. The attackers were closing in. A battle in the snow. Daniel turned to Carter. "We hold them off, or we die trying." Carter swallowed hard but nodded. He wasn't a fighter, but he was desperate. Daniel fired first. A warning shot. One of the figures dropped low, taking cover. Another darted behind a tree. They weren't amateurs. They knew what they were doing. Then, silence. The kind that came before something deadly. A shadow moved on the tree line. Then another. But they weren't men. They were wolves. Daniel's breath caught. Shadow had returned. And she wasn't alone. Her pack had come. And they weren't running this time. The tables turn. A sharp, agonized scream cut through the night. One of the attackers had barely managed to react before a massive shape lunged from the darkness. A blur of fur, teeth, and sheer force. The pack struck like ghosts, moving between the trees with terrifying precision. Daniel barely had time to process what was happening. Carter trembled beside him, staring in shock. What the hell?" Daniel didn't answer. He just watched. This wasn't just a wolf attack. This was vengeance. The men had come into the wild thinking they were the hunters. But they had become the hunted. One of the remaining attackers fired blindly into the woods, his panicked shots disappearing into the darkness. Another scream. Then silence. Daniel exhaled, his grip on the rifle loosening. It was over. A debt repaid. As the first light of dawn crept over the mountains, Daniel stepped outside. The snow was stained with patches of red, but the bodies were gone. The pack had done what they came to do. Shadow stood a few feet away, watching him. Her golden eyes held something deep, something more than instinct. She had saved him. Just as he had once saved her. Carter stepped beside Daniel, still shaken. I don't know what to say." Daniel didn't look at him. "You got somewhere to go?" Carter hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah." "Then go." Carter swallowed hard, then nodded. He knew better than to question it. As Carter disappeared into the valley, Shadow turned toward the woods. For a moment, Daniel thought she would leave again. But then, she took a step closer. She wasn't leaving. Not this time. End of part 6. But what comes next for Daniel and Shadow? Is the danger truly over? Or is there one final twist left in their journey? You said. Part 7 make the finale ending part. ChatGPT said. Part 7, the bond that could not be broken. The morning sun painted the sky in streaks of orange and gold, casting long shadows over the snow-covered land. The battle was over. The attackers were gone. Yet, Daniel knew the wilderness never truly rested. Danger had a way of returning when least expected. Shadow stood a few feet away, her breath rising in the cold air. Her pack had disappeared into the woods, melting back into the untamed wild where they belonged. But she remained. Daniel met her golden eyes. A choice had been made. A quiet farewell. Carter had left at first light, his face still pale from the night's events. He had murmured a quiet, "thank you," before disappearing down the trail, promising to never return. Daniel knew he wouldn't. Some men learned their lessons the hard way. He watched until Carter vanished beyond the ridgeline. Then, he turned back toward the cabin. Shadow was waiting. He knelt down, resting a hand gently against her thick fur. She didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned into him, a quiet acceptance in her stance. "You could go with them," Daniel murmured. "Back to your pack." Shadow's ears twitched, but she didn't move. Daniel sighed, rubbing his calloused fingers against her coat. "You're stubborn, you know that?" A faint whine left her throat, almost amused. And that was that. A new beginning. The following days felt different. The silence of the mountains no longer felt empty. Footsteps beside him in the snow, a presence by the fire, a pair of golden eyes always watching. She was still a wolf. Wild. Unpredictable. But she had chosen to stay. And in a way, so had he. One evening, as Daniel stood on the porch watching the sunset, he felt a nudge against his hand. Shadow. She looked toward the valley, ears twitching. A soft, distant howl echoed through the trees. Her pack was calling. For a moment, Daniel thought she might leave. But then, she turned back to him. A choice had been made. Daniel let out a quiet breath, resting a hand on her head. "Guess you're home, then." Shadow let out a soft huff and sat beside him, her golden eyes fixed on the fading light. The mountains had taken much from Daniel over the years. But they had given him something too. Not just a wolf. A bond that could not be broken. And in the end, that was enough. The night had fallen, quiet and still, with only the distant rustle of the trees and the occasional crackle of the fire to break the silence. The stars above twinkled like diamonds scattered across a velvet sky, and the moon hung low, casting long shadows across the snow-covered ground. A thick blanket of cold settled over the mountains, but the warmth of the fire and the soft crackle of the burning wood kept the chill at bay. Daniel sat alone by the fire, lost in thought. The silence of the evening felt both comforting and heavy. The world around him seemed to hold its breath, as if it too were waiting for something. The days since Shadow had chosen to stay with him had been peaceful. Her wild, untamed nature had found a strange harmony with the stillness of the cabin, and yet Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something was always just on the horizon, something inevitable, something that could disrupt this fragile peace. The howl of a distant wolf pierced the stillness, breaking Daniel's reverie. It wasn't the first time he had heard it since Shadow's arrival, but this time, the sound felt different. It carried a deeper, more urgent note, almost like a plea. It was a call from Shadow's pack, her family. The call that had once belonged to her now echoed across the mountains, summoning her back to the wilderness, to the life she had once known. Daniel's heart sank as he turned his gaze toward Shadow, who stood a few feet away. Her body was tense, her ears flicking as she listened intently, her golden eyes reflecting the soft glow of the fire. He could see the conflict within her. She had chosen to stay with him, but the pull of her pack was stronger than anything he could offer. The wilderness had always been her home, and he couldn't ask her to deny that. "You don't have to go," Daniel said softly, his voice a little rough. It wasn't a plea, but a quiet admission that he would never hold her back, no matter how much he wanted to. He had come to understand that she was wild at heart, and that heart couldn't be confined by walls or promises. But still, the thought of losing her hurt more than he expected. Shadow's gaze never left the distant trees, where the sound of the howls seemed to grow louder. Her muscles rippled beneath her fur, her body coiled with tension as though she were ready to spring into action. Yet, she didn't move. Her golden eyes met his, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. There was no need for words, just the unspoken understanding between them. She had made her choice once before, to stay with him, but now the question lingered in the air: could she remain by his side, or would the call of her pack prove too strong to ignore? The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken thoughts. Then, slowly, Shadow padded closer, her steps silent on the snow. She nudged his hand gently with her nose, her fur warm against his cold skin. Daniel reached down, his fingers brushing through her thick coat. There was something so undeniably comforting in the feel of her fur, something that anchored him to the present, to the quiet solitude they had found together in this wild, unforgiving place. A faint, almost imperceptible whine escaped from her throat, a sound that could have been amusement or sadness, or both. It was a reminder that she was still wild, still a creature of the forest, no matter how much she had come to depend on him. Yet, she had stayed. She had chosen him. Daniel's fingers tightened slightly on her fur. "If you go, I'll understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But you know you'll always have a place here." The words hung in the air, but Shadow did not move. She simply stood there, her gaze fixed on the distant hills, listening for the sound of her pack. And for a brief moment, Daniel thought she might turn and run back to the wild, back to the life she had left behind. The wilderness had always called to her, but in her heart, Daniel had come to realize, she had formed her own bond, a bond that went beyond the wild and into something deeper, something more human. Then, as the distant howls echoed once more, Shadow moved. But instead of running into the night, she paused at the edge of the cabin, her eyes meeting his one last time. There was something about the way she looked at him, something more than just a simple gaze. It was a silent promise, an unspoken vow that no matter where the call of the wild took her, she would always return. Daniel's chest tightened, but a sense of peace washed over him. He knew the wilderness would never truly let go of her, just as he would never truly let go of her either. She was a part of him now, and that bond could never be broken, no matter how far she roamed. With one final glance, Shadow turned and disappeared into the night, her form blending into the shadows of the trees. The howl of her pack grew fainter as she ventured further into the wilderness, but Daniel remained by the fire, staring into the night, his heart full of quiet understanding. The mountains had taken much from him over the years. They had taken his family, his friends, his sense of belonging. But they had given him something too. Not just a wolf, not just a companion in the harshness of the wild, but something far more precious, a bond that no force, no distance, could ever tear apart. And so, Daniel stood there in the stillness, his gaze fixed on the darkened horizon, knowing that no matter what the future held, he would never be truly alone. Days passed in a quiet rhythm, and yet the world outside remained ever-changing. Daniel had learned to accept the stillness of life in the mountains, but the absence of Shadow left a lingering emptiness. Even the cabin, which had once felt like a sanctuary, now seemed hollow without the presence of the wolf whose bond with him had grown deeper than he could have imagined. The fire crackled softly, casting shadows that danced along the walls. Daniel sat by the hearth, his hand resting on the worn edge of his chair. He hadn't been sleeping well. The nights were long, and the silence had become deafening without the familiar sounds of Shadow pacing beside him or the occasional low growl in her throat. Her absence gnawed at him, but he understood. She had returned to her pack, where she belonged. He had never expected her to stay forever, he had known from the start that she was a creature of the wild, untamed and free. But that didn't make the quiet any easier. One evening, as the sky shifted from hues of amber to dark blue, Daniel stepped outside onto the porch, feeling the sharp bite of the mountain air against his skin. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he made his way toward the edge of the cabin. The trees stretched high above him, their branches bare and twisted against the backdrop of the vast, open sky. The landscape was beautiful, serene, but it felt different without Shadow by his side. The howl came again, distant but unmistakable. It was as if the mountains themselves were calling, urging him to listen. He stood still, his breath forming clouds in the cold night air, and waited. He had heard that howl countless times before, but tonight it held a different weight. It carried something deeper, something more urgent. Then, just as quickly as the howl had risen, it stopped. The wind rustled through the trees, and the silence that followed seemed almost suffocating. Daniel turned back toward the cabin, his thoughts heavy with the memories of Shadow. He didn't know where she was now, or if she was even thinking of him. All he knew was that the mountains were a part of her, and she was a part of them. That connection was something that could not be broken, no matter how far she roamed. It wasn't long before a figure emerged from the tree line. A shape, dark and fluid, moving with the grace of something that belonged to the wild. At first, Daniel's heart skipped a beat. For a brief moment, he thought it might be Shadow, returning to him, drawn back by the pull of the bond they had shared. But as the figure grew closer, he realized it wasn't her. It was a wolf, a large, dark figure with piercing eyes and a coat that seemed to blend with the shadows of the night. Daniel stood frozen, his pulse quickening. The wolf stopped just a few feet away, its gaze fixed on him with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. It wasn't aggressive, but it was not welcoming either. The wolf's presence was commanding. As if it had come with a purpose. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The wolf studied Daniel with an air of quiet authority, and Daniel could feel the weight of its gaze. There was something familiar about the creature, but he couldn't place it. He knew it wasn't Shadow. But the resemblance was striking, both in the shape and the eyes. The wolf's golden eyes shone with a strange intensity, much like the wolf he had come to know. Then, as if satisfied with its inspection, the wolf took a few cautious steps forward. Daniel's heart beat faster as it moved closer, the distance between them shrinking with every step. The wolf's fur was thick and dark, its body strong and lithe, much like Shadow's. It was a reminder of the wild, of everything Daniel had come to understand and respect. The wolf stopped just short of him, then lowered its head in a subtle, almost imperceptible gesture. It wasn't an invitation, but it wasn't a threat either. It was a sign of recognition, of respect. Daniel reached out slowly, his hand trembling as he neared the wolf's coat. The animal did not retreat. Instead, it stood still, allowing him to make contact. As his fingers brushed against the thick fur, a soft, familiar rumble of recognition filled the air. Daniel froze. It was a sound he knew well. A sound he had heard countless times before. A sound that came from the depths of Shadow's throat. The wolf before him let out a soft, almost mournful whine. A low, drawn-out note that seemed to vibrate through the air. It was the same sound that Shadow had made, the same communication, the same bond. And in that moment, Daniel understood. This wolf was not here to challenge him, nor was it here to claim him as its own. It had come to deliver a message. A reminder of the wild, of the untamed places where bonds were forged in silence and loyalty. The wolf's presence was a gift. It was Shadow's pack, and it was a sign that, though the wolf had gone, she had not truly left. The wild still called to her, and she still called to it. The wolf lingered for a moment longer, its gaze holding his with quiet intensity. Then, as if satisfied that it had fulfilled its purpose, it turned and disappeared into the trees, vanishing into the darkness from which it came. Daniel stood there for a long while, his breath coming in short, shallow bursts. The weight of the wolf's visit lingered in the air, and for the first time in days, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. Shadow had not forgotten him. She had not left him behind. The bond they shared was still there, undisturbed, waiting to be renewed when the time was right. The wilderness had taken much from him over the years, but it had also given him something he could never lose. Not just a wolf. Not just a companion. But a connection that transcended distance and time. And in that moment, Daniel knew that no matter where the wild took Shadow, or how far she roamed, she would always return to him.